Welcome to the Agatha Christie in Devon podcast. I'm Matt Newbury.
And I'm Sophie Pearce. And this podcast is all about the places in Devon that Agatha loved and inspired her. And today we're at the Steam Railway in Paignton, which is so exciting. I just love steam trains, as did Agatha. She absolutely loved them. And we've actually come to Queen's Park Station in Paignton, which is where the Dartmouth Steam Railway departs from. Now, the line's actually about 160 years old, and it takes passengers along an incredibly scenic, nearly 7-mile route to Kingswear, where you can then take a river ferry across to Dartmouth, and she would have done that.
Yeah, so Agatha would have travelled on this very route coming down from London. It used to be called the Orient Express, and she would get off at Churston Station, and then she'd be picked up by her car and taken down to her holiday home at Greenway. So she'd come on this very route quite a lot. And unfortunately, in 1968, the Ministry of Transport decided, in all their wisdom, to shut the branch beyond Paignton. So you can now get a train down to the terminus in Paignton at the main station, but right next door is this Heritage Railway where you can jump on and you can travel all the way to Kingswear.
And there's something called the round robin that people can do as well.
Yeah, it's like one of the most popular tourist attractions you can do, really. So it involves a boat going up and down the Dart, it involves the train, and it involves a bus, and then you get to go to Dartmouth, Paignton, and to beautiful Totnes.
And you live quite near here, don't you, too? So you get to hear that amazing sound of the whistle quite often.
Yeah, I quite often hear it in the morning when I'm sitting doing some work and you hear the whistle outside. It's very evocative, so yeah, it's a lovely place to live.
Yeah, and as we just said, Agatha loved trains, and she talked about them in her autobiography. And this is what she said. What can beat a train? Especially before the diesels and their smell arrived. A great puffing monster carrying you through gorges and valleys, by waterfalls, past snow mountains, alongside country roads with strange peasants in carts. Trains are wonderful. I adore them. To travel by train is to see nature and human beings, towns and churches and rivers. In fact, to see life. So, looking forward to getting on board.
Passengers for Dartmouth and those of you with round robin or steamer cruise tickets, please change onto the ferry at Kingswear.
So we're joined in this absolutely beautiful compartment by a very special guest. We've got Maria Kerr from English Riviera Custom Tours, aka Miss Lemon. So where did the Miss Lemon come from?
Very good question. So Miss Lemon was actually Poirot's very efficient secretary. So when we began the business, I'm a bit of a fan of a filing system myself, to be perfectly honest. So it seemed a very apt description. So we thought we'd take Miss Lemon as our nom de plume.
And what does Miss Lemon do? What do you do with your visitors?
Right, so we actually help people explore Agatha Christie's Devon just a little bit further. Very popular with us to go to places like Burr Island and, of course, beautiful Greenway. But we also go on to Dartmoor and all those places really that inspired Agatha and places that she's actually associated with as a person.
So what are some of the highlights of this route that people can see as they go along?
Well, I think one of the real definite highlights has got to be a glimpse of Elbury Cove. Absolutely beautiful, beautiful beach, one of Agatha's favourite places to swim herself, but also a massive feature of one or two of her books.
And Poirot took this train at least twice, I think, didn't he?
He did indeed, yeah. We know that he stopped at Churston with the wonderful Hastings, connected to the ABC murders. And then in that book, it is actually named as Churston Station, but it also popped up as Nascombe Station in the wonderful Dead Man's Folly.
And just tell us a little bit about Agatha herself and how familiar this line was to her.
Yeah, it was totally. I mean, she actually took this route herself anyway. She would come down to her house at Greenway, travelling on this line along the beautiful Riviera Express or Torquay Express, depending on which person you ask, really. But there's so much to see on it, and she was very much a fan of this railway herself.
I mean, the views are incredible. We've just
Stunning.
gone past all the bright colours of Goodrington,
Yeah.
with the water park and the beach huts, and then the much wilder Salton Cove.
Absolutely.
And where are we coming up to now?
So we're coming up towards Broad Sands, and then we're going to get a little glimpse of Elbury in a minute. But it's just beautiful with the beach huts, and it causes so much excitement when people are on this train.
So we're just about to travel over one of Brunel's lofty viaducts. There's 2 viaducts on this route. So this is on one of your itineraries, isn't it? So what could people expect on that day out?
Yeah, it is indeed. It's actually all our tours are chapters because we very much hope that people will write their own travel story. And so this features in chapter 1, which is linked to Greenway itself. There is no better way to see Greenway than travelling on this steam train and then the ferry and then landing at the bottom of Agatha's garden.
So what do you think is so evocative about steam trains, and more importantly, why are they such a good place for a murder?
Great question. Well, there is so much. Obviously the smells of the steam and the sound of the whistles are very evocative of a bygone age. But what a great place for a murder, because you've got these enclosed carriages, you've got those tunnels to give you the cover of darkness. There's just so much opportunity there, isn't there? There really is.
And do you think that by actually coming on the train and feeling the experience and seeing the steam, it helps to sort of bring those kind of atmospheres alive?
Yeah, very much so. And I just think, if you go to Greenway and you travel by car, that's lovely, but a steam train is a really, really special experience.
Yes, it's definitely like travelling back in time, isn't it? I mean, I'm far too young to remember trains like this, but Sophie, you must have travelled on a few, didn't you?
Oh yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Matt. No, seriously, I do remember as a very small child, they weren't steam trains obviously, but the diesel trains still did have the compartments, and that was always quite exciting because, as Maria says, it's that feeling of being enclosed in that small world, which actually can be a bit menacing, especially if you're in the compartment with somebody you don't particularly like the look of. Well, we're about to go into Greenway Tunnel. You probably heard there. Luckily the lights are still on, otherwise we'd be worried that one of us might disappear by the time we come out the other end of the tunnel. But actually this was the scene of a childhood adventure actually by Agatha's grandson, Matthew Pritchard. And Matt, you spoke to him about that, didn't you?
My stepfather, who had rather a mischievous sense of humour, persuaded me one day that we had to walk underneath the tunnel. So he spent a week
along the railway tracks.
Along the railway
Wow.
tracks, and he got all the timetables out, and he worked out a period of whatever it was, 20 minutes that we had in order to walk under it without meeting a train. My mother had a heart in her mouth, I think, when we set off, at the appropriate hour, and we walked through the tunnel, and we made it by comfortably, but not, we did hear the whistle blowing from the other end of the tunnel when we got there.
I should just say that people shouldn't attempt that. That was different times.
Yeah.
We wouldn't advise doing that today, but thank you, Matthew.
We will shortly be arriving at Kingsway. Kingsway for Dartmouth is our next station stop. Any passengers for Dartmouth, or with steam and cruise or round robin tickets, will need to change here for the ferry service. You will find the ferry at the far end of the platform. It's by walking in the present.
Lean out the window to open the door. Can you manage it?
Yeah, there we go. It's quite a gap. So here on the platform at Kingsway, you've got beautiful views of all the brightly painted houses of Dartmouth over on the other side of the river, and you can see all the boats and their masts in the water right by the station. And for Christie fans, there's quite a few options, aren't there, at this point?
So you can either cross the river on the river ferry and go and visit Dartmouth, which is where she set the regatta mystery, or you could jump on the Christie Bell, which is a little boat that would take you up to Greenway House and go and visit her former holiday home. Or if you're feeling really energetic, you could take the 4-mile walk along the coast and go and visit Greenway that way.
And that is a really, really beautiful walk, actually. But we've decided on this occasion to take the ferry over to Dartmouth. And while we wait for the ferry, Matt, you've been speaking to Andrew Eames. Now, he's a travel writer, broadcaster and former newspaper journalist. And in his book, The 8:55 to Baghdad, he retraces a solo train journey made by Agatha Christie from London to Baghdad in 1928, a journey that was to change her life completely.
Well, she'd gone through a really difficult the most difficult part of her life, where her marriage broke up. and she'd made that famous, well, escape's probably not the right word, but she disappeared for 10 days up to Harrogate and hoped to resurrect her relationship, but in the end, it didn't work out. And then about a year later, she went to a dinner in which it was discussed that some of the other dinner party members were discussing going to Baghdad, going to Iraq, what was called Mesopotamia then. It was kind of a fashionable thing to do. It's hard to imagine today, but the archaeology that was going on, the elite of society were going to see, because it was meant to be the new Tutankhamun was being discovered down in southern Iraq, in Mesopotamia. And some of these archaeologists were like kind of rock stars of the time, so Leonard Woolley particularly. And he was a bit of a showman, and he liked having people visit him. And it was discussed at this dinner party that it was quite easy to go because there were two fabulous trains that basically took you most of the way there. And I think she thought, well, it's a restart. I think she says in her autobiography, it was a chance to discover what she really was, because up till then she'd kind of been a wife and getting well known as a writer, but she didn't really have individual self-confidence that she felt she needed to, or she wanted to test her own ability to navigate her own way through the world and not just being a partner of somebody else. So that was the kind of fundamentals. She liked train travel, and she was quite adventurous in her own quiet way, even before then. So all of those things came at the right moment, and off she went, really.
And I mean, that is quite an adventurous thing to do for a newly single woman. Even when you're on the sort of glamorous Orient Express, it's still quite an adventurous thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the trains, to some extent, because it's a very elite society that's traveling on those trains, ambassadors and all sorts, that they're very well curated by the staff that are on them in those days. I think probably the most adventurous bit of her journey was back in when she first did it. The train didn't go all of latterly, the Tourist Express went all the way to Baghdad. So that was quite a straightforward journey. But when she first did it, the train only went to Damascus, and she had to go across the desert. It was about 500 kilometers, in effectively what was a big taxi. It was a sort of minibus of its time. And that must have been a ropey old journey, because it wasn't really a proper road. The sand in the desert is not very soft, so you could drive across it, but it wasn't going across tarmac. And so these, the Nairn brothers, they were called, the New Zealand guys who ran this service across the desert. They were very adventurous, and they completely equipped the whole thing like an expedition, really. So you just didn't know who you were going to travel with. So I think that was really quite an adventurous part of her journey. And just to pitch up into, a very exotic part of the world, that's pretty brave for somebody who'd really never traveled solo before.
And of course, her various trips on the Orient Express, because she travelled on the train several times, inspired one of her most famous books.
Yes, well, when it got stuck in, it was after she'd travelled to Iraq on it, 1930, I think it was. There was a freak snowstorm on the border between Turkey and Bulgaria, and it got trapped in the snow, and it took a while for them to dig it out. There were no murders, but it was her typical situation, isn't it? Where you get a group of people, very disparate group of people who are stuck somewhere together, and there's no escaping. So it has to be one of them, and then she has to, and then you have to puzzle it out with her or her detective. Yeah, so it was a beautiful scenario, a very typical scenario. And I think she, in her journeys on the Orient Express, because she'd already done several by then, she must have got some good ideas for her characters, people who are traveling on the train.
So why did you decide to recreate the Baghdad journey, and what challenges did you face along the way? It's a lot harder in this day and age, isn't it?
Yes, because in those days, you could get, after the first couple of years, the first time, as I said, she traveled, she had to go to Damascus and then catch this cross-desert minibus, effectively. After a couple further years, the train was then connected all the way through to Baghdad. And she just took the Orient Express to Istanbul, and then the Tourist Express from Istanbul all the way to Baghdad. So that was really quite easy. I first came across it. I'm a journalist, and I was in Syria I've been to Syria a couple of times in the 90s, and I stayed in a hotel called the Baron in the northern city of Aleppo, and met the hotel owner and his mother, who just said, "Oh yeah, I mean, Agatha Christie used to come here regularly to have tea and do shopping and things like that." And it just didn't square with my idea of Agatha Christie, which was all about vicarage tea parties and, the Reverend did it with the lead piping. So that was a real surprise. And then, I almost didn't really think much of it. And then I just happened to pick up some months after I stayed in that hotel, Murder on the Orient Express, the book, and read the first chapter. It starts on the railway station platform at Aleppo. And just a couple of months before, I'd been standing on that railway station platform in Aleppo to get the train back to Damascus. So it just struck me that somebody was steering me in the direction of this story. And then when I started to look at it even more, then I realized that this journey was the kind of turning point in her life, sort of midpoint, that up till then she'd been this Mrs. Christie who'd wrote books on the side. And then she made this very adventurous journey. And in Iraq, she met Max Mallowan. Not the first time, actually. It was the second time she met Max Mallowan, who was to become her second husband. And thereafter, she would spend many a winter season on dig sites, on archaeological digs in Iraq, which is a part of her life that a lot of people didn't know about. I certainly didn't. And I thought it was well worth exploring as a storyline, as a journey, particularly because, as you say, the journey has become much harder. So I could take the Venice Simplon Orient Express runs to Venice, and then I patched together a load of local trains until I got into Turkey. And then from Adana in Turkey, there is something still called the Taurus Express, but it's actually a Turkish train which goes across to the eastern side of Turkey. But it does once a week have a Syrian sleeping car attached to it, or it did. And that Syrian sleeping car gets close to the border and then gets detached, and a Syrian locomotive comes across the border from Syria and picks it up and pulls it into Syria. And that's actually it's a very, it's kind of a slightly hair-raising border crossing, because Syria and Turkey are not best of chums, or they weren't then. And there was a lot of military around and some smuggling and some strange characters on that train. So that was an interesting part of the journey. And then I traveled down to Aleppo, actually in the locomotive with the driver, who was very keen to show me how wonderful it all was. Well, it wasn't wonderful at all. It was a rickety old German-made diesel that was serviced once every 10 years, he said, on very rickety tracks. And you could kind of see them. They were like knitting needles laid end to end, and they weren't very straight. But the locomotive kind of ironed it straight as it went across them. And there were no level crossings or anything like that. When the roads came across the railway line, the train just slowed down and hooted very loudly in the hope that everything would stop and let it pass. Yeah, it was quite primitive. And then for my last part of my journey, I got to Damascus and then went across the desert, or there's now a road, in a bus of a very motley collection of people, a bit like the motley collection that would have been on the Orient Express when it got trapped in the snow. These are people who were going into Iraq for very dubious motives just before the war broke out. So all sorts of weird people. So yeah, it was an interesting journey at a strange time, because it was 3 months before the invasion of Iraq.
So Agatha said she adored trains. What do you think it is about trains from that sort of, I suppose, that golden age of travel? What do you think is so special about a train journey? That
well, I think as I said, that the luxury trains were very carefully curated for the elite, so you were cared for. But also, she was a great observer of people, and trains are a place to sit opposite somebody and enter into conversation with them and speculate about them across the aisle and all of that. And with trains, you can see into people's backyards. In a road, you go down and a funnel of shops and shopping centres and motorway services and all the rest of it. But trains just go around the back, and you get much more of an insight into where you're going through in a train.
So a trip on the Orient Express, of course, because of the book, has become a bucket list trip for pretty much every Agatha Christie fan. And you've travelled on the Orient Express, you mentioned. Is it worth all the hype?
You do have to have, what is it, £1,500 spare change, but just for one. I mean, obviously 3,000 if there's going to be two of you. I enjoyed it. It's a touch of something very elegant that doesn't exist anywhere else anymore. It's been kept very authentic. The carriages are still very authentic, to the extent that there are no ensuite facilities in your cabin. You have to sashay down the corridor in your kimono to go and have a shower or go to the loo. And I think a lot of the American customers are disturbed by that. For the amount of money they're paying, they're only spending one night on board for £1,500 and there's no ensuite facilities. They're quite shocked by that. And the heating in the carriages, there's still coal heating in a couple of the carriages. It's still very, very antique. And yet it rattles across Europe at some considerable speed. And it goes a long way. Paris to Venice is a long journey, and it does it it's just under 24 hours, I think so. It's a serious journey undertaken by a classic train in the style that really hasn't changed. And of course, the eating is going to the dining cars is very much the event everyone dresses up for. But yeah, I think if you've got that kind of cash and it's a special thing for anniversaries, that kind of thing, it's well worth enjoying.
Thank you, Andrew. So we've now come over to Dartmouth, and Christie fans might be interested to know that several scenes from the 1984 film Ordeal by Innocence were filmed here, and that film starred Donald Sutherland, Christopher Plummer and Faye Dunaway, and they were filmed all around Dartmouth, in Kingswear, at Greenway Quay and also Paynton Picture House.
An amazing array of stars there. So we're going to have a little wander around this charming naval town now, and while we do that, we're going to play you our regular feature, What Christie Means to Me, in 3, where we ask a fan or an expert to explain why they love her so much. So this week we're chatting to Indian novelist Meenakshi Reddy Madhavan, who is a lifelong Agatha Christie fan and now lives in Berlin.
India in the 80s and 90s, when I grew up, might as well have been England of the 40s and 50s, in terms of the rigid social rules and the class system. When I was growing up also, there was the start of the new mysterious beast of a genre called Indian writing in English. I hope you can hear the capital letters in that. IWE, we eventually shortened it to. Not many people were writing in English then, and even fewer than that were writing books that we, as children, as young adults, wanted to read. And so you take a murder mystery, not too gory, but laid out like a puzzle. You take all these people who you sort of recognize in a completely different context. And above all, you take a super intelligent detective who everyone underestimates, who has all these little quirks and cliches, and all who meet him make fun of him until he solves the case in a great rush of glory and everyone has to eat their words. I don't think you could call Agatha Christie a children's author, but I think all of us who have encountered her, which is almost everyone who has ever read a book or heard of one, in my view, encountered her in childhood. Because that detective, Hercule Poirot, I mean, is a child narrator. I don't mean he's simple or innocent or without agency, but in many ways he represents the child, someone not taken seriously until the end when he proves himself. I was a serious child reader, and so I avoided Christie because I felt I was above her. My classmates read her along with Sidney Sheldon, and I thought the two belonged together. Junk books for people who didn't really like to read. Except in those days, we didn't have much on television, and smartphones weren't even a twinkle in Steve Jobs' eye. When I finally came to her, I must have been in my teens. It was a revelation. I can't remember the first Christie I read, but I remember my feeling, almost like falling in love. Here were puzzle boxes of books, well written and plotted, and so many of them. It felt like I'd never read them all, and as a voracious reader, this was a very comforting feeling. I remember one summer holiday, I went to stay with my father's mother and my aunt and uncle in Kerala. My aunt had all of Christie's books, lined up neatly in a little reading nook she built. I remember this holiday so well because all I did from the moment I woke up was read her collection. And still I wasn't finished by the end of the holiday. This particular smell comes back to me. Kerala is very damp and humid, so it was that plus the mustiness of the books, a sort of sweet smell, which I now always associate with reading. Later, as I grew older, I met Christie as an adult. In college, for instance, one of the set texts was The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. I'd never read it before, and even though my module was classic literature, Medea and all the rest of it, I borrowed my friend's copy and read it all the way through and was also surprised by the ending, like so many people are. I swapped out Poirot as my favorite detective for Miss Marple. I liked her domesticity more, her unexpected way of solving cases. My favorite Miss Marple is A Murder's Announced. My favorite Poirot is The ABC Murders. Agatha Christie became as familiar to me as my own writing life. I read her autobiography on a friend's recommendation and was so entranced by the story that it might as well have been fiction. I wondered about her missing week, like so many other people. There's not a time in my life that I can recall that I didn't know the significance of the words the little grey cells. Recently, learning German, my class came across the word Doc, which I suppose translates loosely into but yes. My fellow students struggled with the word and how to apply it, but for me, it jumped off the page, and I turned to a classmate and said, "It's just like mais oui." And she looked at me blankly and said, "I don't speak French." Neither do I, but I heard Hercule Poirot.
Thank you, Meenakshi. So we've now wandered a little bit further down the banks of the River Dart, and we're looking back over towards Kingswear, and we can see the train puffing away in the distance. And Agatha Christie really loved steam trains. She described them as being one of her favourite things in the world. And she, of course, wrote several books set on trains. So there's the 450 from Paddington, which is a Miss Marple story. There's The Mystery of the Blue Train. There's a short story called The Girl in the Train, and most famously, Murder on the Orient Express.
I mean, that whole idea of the Orient Express has become a cultural phenomenon, hasn't it? Thanks to Agatha Christie. And she wrote about this in her autobiography, saying, "All my life I had wanted to go on the Orient Express. When I had travelled to France or Spain or Italy, the Orient Express had often been standing at Calais, and I had longed to climb up into it," which of course she did eventually.
Yeah, she went to a dinner party in 1928, and a fellow diner described the Orient Express, and it led to Agatha Christie going on a solo journey to Baghdad, and then a further trip led to her go to Iraq, where she met her second husband Max Mallowan on an archaeological dig.
And I think there's no doubt really that the descriptions in her books have made these activities and places just desirable, and people want to do them.
I mean, every Agatha Christie fan wants to go on a trip on the Orient Express or go down the Nile. I mean, I've never managed to do it myself, have you?
I haven't, but I'd love to do it one day. And it's interesting actually that Agatha Christie's last public appearance was at the premiere of the 1974 film of Murder on the Orient Express, which of course had a whole host of stars. That was when she was 84, and there's a lovely photo of her greeting Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. Well, we're back at Kingswear Station, and actually we just popped into the Steam Packet Inn above the station, and there's an amazing mural there by a Brixham artist which shows Agatha Christie there by the railway. And
yeah, waiting for a train. It's a Brixham artist called Paul Aldos, and he did that in 2022 apparently.
So that's something to seek out if you're in the area. But yeah, we're quite excited because we've been offered the chance of a ride on the footplate, which we've never done before. And we've been kitted out in these black overalls. Excited, Matt?
Yeah, I'm very excited. I didn't know I wanted to do this until I was offered the chance to do it. We've got special glasses to protect our eyes, and hopefully we'll get to pull the whistle.
Fantastic. Lots of steam. Sarah here's just guarding us up. Gosh, it's a summer's day, and this fire is going, coal fire is like a blazing heart of the train.
Did you bring any marshmallows to toast?
Damn, I forgot. We've just arrived at Paignton, and this is the end of this episode, which has been such a lot of fun. But Matt, I think there's something you've just been longing to do, haven't you?
Do you think I might be able to pull the whistle? Do you call it pulling it?
Of course you can.
Thank you. Do you want to do it as well? You can both hold it together if you want.
All right, then here we go.
Right. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
This podcast was recorded on location in Devon, England in August 2024 and is brought to you by the Agatha Christie Festival. It was funded by the Torbay Heritage Grant Scheme. This is a collaboration between Torbay Council, Torbay Culture and the English Riviera UNESCO Global Geopark, with investment from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Thanks to our guests Maria Kerr, Andrew Eames and Meenakshi Reddy Madhavan. Original music and design by Rob Hoskins at Design by Hoskins. Join us at the Agatha Christie Festival every September on the English Riviera. Visit www.agathachristiefestival.com.